Welcome.
You're getting in the spirit of it.
Welcome to the Telemetrists Meets the Experientialists. Everyone needs to say that 10 times fast. I'm Mike McFadden. I'll be kind of hosting our panel today, and we're excited to get started. This is going to be an interactive panel, so as we have several questions and answers coming from up here, if you do have any questions, even as we are on a specific subject and topic, please raise your hand. We'd like to keep this as much of a dialogue as possible, as well as make my job easier. And that's just the end of the day. Well, last October, an article in Harvard Business Review called Data Scientist, the Sexiest Job of the 21st Century. As I look down the line, which one do you think is a data scientist?
Obviously you, Mike.
I mean, goes without saying. Well, I heard there were some experienced designers who are contesting these results, particularly because the judges were actually data scientists. But we're not here to debate who the sexiest is. We'll do that at the cocktail reception. We're really here to discuss how do we combine the science, the analysis, the figures, with the abstraction and the art of design. Which drives which? Does design drive the data, or does the data drive the design? Today I'm joined by 4 supermodels in their respective sexy fields.
Overworking the metaphor.
Yeah, I'll probably drop that in at least 3 times. Those who tweet it, there's a prize. You don't want to know what it is. First, I'm going to introduce Cameron Turner. Cameron holds a degree from Dartmouth and Oxford and is currently pursuing another master's degree at Stanford. We'll see if 3 is enough. But while pursuing his first master's degree at Oxford, he founded Clickstream Technologies, a digital experience measurement platform, which he then sold to Microsoft. Next to him, he is also one of the founders of the Data Guild, a startup with quite a bit of experience behind it out of Palo Alto. Next to him is a partner and principal at the Data Guild as well, David Gutelius. He has a fascinating background. Previously drove data science and technology as the chief scientist at Jive Software, which purchased his company, Proximity Labs, a startup focused on machine learning over big data to personalize enterprise social networks. To his left is Corey Bernardo. He's the vice president of global experience design with Hewlett-Packard. He has been a practicing designer for over 2 decades, from consulting to startups to web innovators to Fortune 100 companies. And to his left is Tim Wood. He's the vice president of design and user experience at EffectiveUI, where he leads the company's design initiatives and helps clients transform their business through user experience. Enough with the intros. Let's get to the meat of this. We'll start off with a little lob ball to Cam. For those who don't play softball, it's just a nice high pitch. Make it nice and easy to start. Why do you think data science and big data is so sexy now?
Well, it's funny. We were talking yesterday about normalization. I think there's a lot of researchers in the audience. I think there's a lot of self-reporting bias and context bias based on that comment. But I think, if you sort of normalize your range of what's sexy and you look just at data scientists, you're operating in a very left-leaning section of the spectrum. But I think, undeniably we're at a point now in time where data has taken sort of a front and center role in how business is done, and specifically how data-driven decision-making, data-driven design is occurring. And it's happened through an evolution. I don't think anyone who's been involved in analyzing data as a part of their job sees big data or data-driven design as something that's new. It's something that was sort of tagged recently, I think, and has been sort of accelerated for a lot of different reasons, a lot of new products in the market, addressing an acute problem that everyone feels. And the problem is this, that if you look at sort of the history going back all the way to the Industrial Revolution, we started to develop products, and those products develop a lot of data exhaust, and that exhaust became more normalized and more schema-driven. And as we start to amass that, and it starts to be comparable, and specifically comparable across platforms, you get to a point where you're remiss to not leverage that asset as an organization. And I think it's most interesting right now, and sort of in the context of this conversation, in how you blend together design and the discipline of design and data extraction, data analysis, and insight gathering. So data-driven design is almost an oxymoron in the sense that you're talking about something that's extremely left brain and something that's extremely right brain, or has been historically. And how we bring those two pieces together, I think, presents a big opportunity that's a competitive advantage and also a threat if you're not sort of taking advantage of what you have.
On that note, Corey, maybe this is for you, and actually to the panel, but maybe we start with you here, could you give an example how big data has informed experience design, or how organizations you're currently working with or have previously effectively uses data?
Sure. First off, I'm going to apologize for the lens flare to the people in the back. Asked for makeup, but didn't get any. So if I go back a couple of decades, I started working for a company called Cognos. IBM owns them now. World's leader, business intelligence, data mining. This is prior to, and I will say, big data becoming almost a catchphrase that it has become today. Then it was all about analyzing multi-dimensional cubes of data. Like, think about that, multi-dimensional data, right? Pretty complex. Could really benefited from, some hardcore data scientists. From there, when I was at eBay and PayPal were, at least probably still are, some of the largest vendors of Omniture and Site Catalyst, right? Traditional web analytics, but terabytes of data, whether it be traffic analysis, conversion rates, usage data. There, under the realm of data, it was all about leveraging that data and using it to inform, for instance, a payment flow on a mobile device. How do you improve conversion, right? Because that translates directly to dollars. You improve the user experience, that translates directly to business dollars. And then, currently I'm with HP. If I just look at, pull out our consumer printer business, when you look at that, we have 140 million units in the market, right, install base. Each of those is all cloud connected, web connected, the firmware, the drivers, everything talks back to our servers, right? And so we know everything about how many pages you're printing, your ink levels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's pretty hardcore big data and requires some certain analysis, but we use that not just to look at usage, but the entire, what we would say is the entire customer experience journey, right? From pre-sale, research, purchase decisions, through purchase, through usage, right? And so we leverage that across the board. I think just a key thing I'd point and then pass it back, Mike, is that you have to be careful that, and all these companies I've worked for, reams and reams of data, but you can wind up in this sort of analysis paralysis, and sometimes it definitely is about the left brain, right brain. Trust that intuition, right, as a good, solid, experienced designer, make a decision, move forward, so.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Dave, would you like to share a little bit on maybe your experience at Dartmouth and how big data has informed design?
Yeah, so a little bit of a different example from my experience. I was an artificial intelligence center at SRI in Menlo Park for 9 years. And the last thing that I worked on there was a DARPA-funded initiative called CALO, Cognitive Assistant That Learns and Organizes. And you might have heard of CALO because Siri came out of that project. I was the PM on CALO. And design in that context for us became a really, not just critical component of how our products were being designed themselves for fielding with DoD and intelligence officers in the field, but a matter of life and death. And so we developed this almost motto of design like your life depended on it, because frankly, we were. And for us, the design, that meant a couple of different things. So for us, the types of products that we were designing had what we call a human-machine feedback loop. So it wasn't simply we were giving a bunch of analytics or dashboards to users to do something with. These software products were actually learning products. They were learning software. And these learning applications took in feedback from our user base. So a forward operating officer, in Fallujah would use the software in a way and give us feedback through feature signaling that we would then incorporate into a larger sort of knowledge base that would be shared more widely across the user base. The whole idea was to get inside of the enemy feedback loop. So the enemy at that time in the mid-2000s was inventing things right and left, frankly a lot better than our forces were. And so the software became a way of increasing our innovation loop, increasing the velocity through which we could actually respond to stuff happening in the field. So design in that for us is if people aren't using the software, if people aren't giving us signals to learn from, you can imagine the quality of the signaling that we're getting is going down. And so what's happening with that software is it's becoming less responsive to users and ultimately making less of a difference in their lives. It's not solving the problems that we intended it to. And so that meant for us designing, both a bunch of kind of algorithms that work on the right side and a bunch of very elegant, very simple designs from the human point of view so that we could maximize the feedback going between the machine and the human. And we'd spent a lot of time getting it wrong. Fortunately, we had a wonderful user base. Before we actually fielded it overseas, we had a wonderful user base that gave us a good baseline. And we knew that when that thing went live, it would actually work well for users. So for us, the design was never, we're going to do some data-driven design now, begin. It was from the get-go, the machine, the product had to operate in a certain way where human feedback was critical. If we didn't get that piece right, nothing worked.
Wonderful. Cam, maybe as we just come down, if you want to pull some of the work that you've done on maybe through your experience at Microsoft.
Just to riff a little bit on Corey's point, I think one of the things that's happened and why big data makes sense as a notion, people can understand it, is that we made our world sort of complex. And I worked on sort of the flip side where Corey was in my last job, running the telemetry team at Windows. And so we were seeing the crash and error reporting as well as usage reporting coming through. And when you start to sort of build out sort of the n-dimensional matrix of all worldwide languages, all printers, all drivers, and then try to isolate the factors that lead to one person's either success or failure in a specific scenario moving through a user experience. It is a problem that involves a lot of data, and I think hence people sort of think big data. Now, I think the incorrect conclusion that people make is that the problem is the data, and so there's a lot of spend that occurs on building systems to sort of collect and store. So I think we're right now really at the very beginning of a process that's going to evolve. To use an analogy, people say that big data is the new oil. Well, that could be, but it's highly unrefined. And unrefined oil, light sweet crude, is good for nothing. It really does nothing for you. You have to refine it. You have to separate out the different components. You have to understand, what's useful in there and what it's going to be used for as a lubricant or as energy. And so we're in that process of going from, to use another analogy, going from talking about wheat to talking about bread and baked goods. Like we haven't yet gotten sort of over the hurdle to think about sort of what the outcomes are. And I think, just to riff on another point, Dave was making, I think that you can save yourself a lot of the evolution by skipping forward and saying, what do I want to work from? At the end of the day, what am I trying to do? Is it about making, forward-moving, U.S. troops more intelligent about the enemy and working backwards into the systems required in order to do that? Are you working towards a specific success point for a user in an experience, be it for entertainment or for critical business use, and then work your way backwards into what that experience is? But what the data gives us is a real-time feedback loop. So it's not that we create reports and dashboards and then sit and ponder the meaning of those things and then go design the next iteration of things. So that the product itself is either the data or it's a direct derivative of it. You're taking the actual outcome of the data and letting the data redesign the user experience in real time. I think that piece is what's going to radically change, and I think that's why we sit at this table and why the left and right brain kind of like are forced to just smash together on that point.
Kind of on that, I'm going to ask Tim here. I mean, how are you seeing, how can big data really change the game in experience design?
Well, I think we've been talking about or talking around two fundamental ideas here in terms of what big data is going to do for experience design. And the first one is really understanding how big data may enable new experiences and new interactions. Kind of speaking to where you were going with customer journey and really getting into some of the analysis there. And related to that is the kind of the second topic that I'm hearing between all of us, I think, so far. You guys can agree or disagree, is the fact that big data needs to change or alter our design methods and techniques, right? I think that's kind of what we've been talking about. And I think, in some of the cases that you've discussed and what Cameron's discussed, you're starting to take action in those two spaces. I think that anytime a new technology is introduced, into the market, it has, it can have a very powerful and sometimes unpredictable impact on user experience. Classically, the challenge for any designer, right, is to understand how to potentially unlock that technology for the benefit of the user, right, and really make sense of all of that. And it sounds like maybe, Corey, you're doing this at HP, like right now, right?
Yeah, this is a really good thing, right? So building on that whole idea of new processes for defining the end-to-end user experience. So not to, just to sort of complement that, I think that's where data, big data especially, can help us invent new business models. Current example at HP is, I was talking about all this data we collect from the printers, right, about usage and behavior and levels. Well, every one of these printers is cloud connected, web connected, right, speaks to us. So we go through and we analyze that data. We also pepper it, if you will, with a little bit of qualitative insights. And as an example, we just recently launched a couple new business models. One is a subscription model, kind of like a Spotify or a Netflix. So probably most of you would agree there's a lot of folks who feel, environmentally printing kills trees, etc. The cost of ink is exorbitant. So we introduced an ink subscription model with various price points that automatically talks to your printer, and we know your ink levels. You subscribe, it's half the cost, and when your ink levels are down, we just ship you new ink to your door. And it doesn't matter if you, as a designer, let's say, print a 300 DPI photo, right, or if it's just some black and white text. So I think that's an additional area is really informing the business, and I think, Cam, you were talking about that as well.
One other point you made before, Corey, I think is also really critical, is separating out how you operate in design with vision versus how you influence your decisions with data. And I think that's it's been an either or kind of thing, yep. and there's definitely a style question there as well. Mm-hmm. And I think we've all had, worked in different organizations where you have sort of a management team that's shoot from the hip and can't be influenced otherwise and will head a direction based on what they feel is right. Yep. And then sort of the analysis paralysis scenario of, the pure quant sort of mindset. And I think, if you can find that blend, and there's great examples now, I think, of where, that's starting to be done very well, where you can blend in and have the vision and then blend in what you know about the market to develop a vision. I think that's important. I just want to make one other point. There's a scathing piece yesterday that was in TechCrunch about Twitter being too data-driven in terms of product development. And if they would step away and think about, what's the vision for where things should go instead of what the data is telling them, right, that they would have more to offer the market. And of course, there's lots of writing going on because of...
I would almost argue that from a design perspective, maybe the vision changes now. So, we're instead of, thinking about design from a lowest common denominator, mass market perspective, or dovetailing into very specific user segmentation and profiling, and those more classical techniques that we're applying today on a daily basis all the time. And Corey, you're very familiar with this because this is what you do every day too. really now the challenge begins to be focused on how can we start designing interactive systems of any flavor in any type of environment that can become more dynamic, more flexible, and more fluid to really start to adapt to the flood of potential data coming from the user in real time. And Cameron, you and I were talking about this a little bit this morning, right? How do we design systems that can automatically adapt and modify themselves based on real-time input from the user?
Yeah, and making our design process accountable to the asset, I think, is a real key point, because if people have a direction in mind, or, I mean, let's take this down to a real level. You're designing a user interface for a specific persona. You should be able to quantify that persona.
Yes.
You should be able to talk about why that group of users, that segment, or even that person is critical to your business. And I think that there's an accountability question there that says, hey, we know this about our user base. Like, let's leverage that asset in order to do intelligent targeting of our community, and not just individuals, but in specific scenarios, in different contexts, at home, at work, mobile, non-mobile, desktop. I mean, all these things come into play. I think that's sort of where design will take us. Is that accountability back to the data?
Right.
Yeah, and if I could just add in, Mike, Cam, I think one of the key words you said earlier, right, is you talked about the or. And it really is about the and, right? Not just, and a few examples are, the art and the science of design, right? The left and the right brain, the qual and the quant, right? All those are factors. And the other thing that I would say is that, as let's say experienced designers, to give ourselves a label, right? It is about not only that entire customer experience journey. It's about the entire, let's say, the product life cycle. Meaning that, early on, data can be used in whatever format to help us vet concepts, right? When you're in the middle of creating some concept, could be a hard good, a product, a software, a mobile device, then it's all about design iteration, right, through empirical measurement of data and usage, right? Post-launch, it's all about, post-launch, it's all about, understanding actual usage, right, and feeding that all the way back into the life cycle. So
and I want to connect the dots back to David. I think the thing that's really exciting for me as a designer is starting to understand how all this data is being utilized to improve, the automated processes within these applications, and what that really means in terms of being able to predict what the user might do and being able to serve them the right features and functions at the right appropriate time in their workflow.
Yeah. I mean, it goes to several levels. I mean, one is being able to create basically customized adaptive experiences for users in different contexts, a little bit like you were describing, I think. Another way, though, you can think about it is, again, if you think about machines that learn and adapt in real time, thinking through sort of, if you had that capability, what problems could you solve for people, right? And so one of the ones that I've worked on in my first startup was behavioral health, and learning across a very large population of chronic disease patients. Everybody experiences their sort of chronic condition in different ways.
I know I do.
Yeah, I do too. And so the challenge becomes, can you learn enough about not just sort of the psychographic segment, but that person, and get them interventions in a personalized way. So design an experience through time that actually helps them in their daily life. And it becomes this really interesting design problem, both on the data side and kind of what you do with the data that you get, but also maximizing kind of the interface side of it too, so that you get the maximum impact that you want.
You can communicate
users.
to them in the most impactful
exactly.
way.
Exactly.
If I can just comment on that, and there's a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would like to.
So.
We're going to open up to questions here in a second, and then jump back into some.
What's interesting about one of the things that you said, I mean, the two examples that you brought up, right? The medical industry, and military, right? And both are, in terms of data, very critical, almost black and white, in terms of. What I mean by that is not in a demeaning way, from the usable nature of conveying the information, et cetera, right? It's really critical. What I love is that you brought up the fact that, okay, outside of that, right, it is all about taking the data to understand your segment, your persona, right, attitudes, behaviors, and then how do you feed them back to something that's relevant, contextual, etc.
We have a question in the way back.
Yeah, some of the most interesting and sort of visionarily inspiring work that I've done is just what you guys are talking about, understanding both the qualitative side of research and the sort of human voice, customer voice side of things, and the quantitative side. You might think that they wouldn't necessarily match up, but from my experience, they actually have. Can you give some concrete examples? Maybe Cameron, from the perspective of a quantitative researcher, of where something qualitative has really given you insight about the big data side of things, and maybe the design side, the opposite.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a lot of great examples, and actually a point just to sort of lead into that, I think that the notion of bringing sensor data into sort of what we do in practice for user experience also is not a new idea to hardware companies specifically. Folks, I know there's folks here from Honeywell, Rambus, other places. Like, the data always existed. There was a way of collecting that and looking at failure scenarios. So, I kind of think there's sort of a continuum, and you could think of it as sort of a Pareto of severity. And at sort of the left side of the graph, which would be this side for you guys, you kind of have things that are known failure, like a system crashing, a blue screen on a Windows machine, a drive failure, hardware blowing up. I mean, these are things that there's no question that we've hit a severity level where there's no qualitative feedback required, right? When things explode, like, bad things happen, when data loss happens. And as you continue down that continuum, I think you move into spaces that become harder to measure. You talk about experiential factors and trying to quantify them in a common way. And I think that's where sort of the fun of data science comes in, because you start to tease apart problems and unpack problems in ways, not just in user segmentation, but discern based on all the dimensions that you have available to you, what things sort of hang together. And from that, that process, you start to develop some new truths. And those new truths are well, frankly, they're money. They're new money that you can find for your business. And I think to me, that's an exciting thing for whatever your objective is, whether you're a for-profit or not-for-profit. Setting that sort of outcome response that you're interested. So I think your question around examples. Research, I think teams that I've seen work very well together are able to do hypothesis creation and validation, swapping back and forth between quant data and qual data, where doing a customer visit contextual inquiry can really unearth some new patterns that you may want to validate in the broad market. By looking at clickstream patterns and sequential analysis, you can see, yes, that is, and actually we can quantify that as a percentage of our market that kind of goes after that. So I think that's maybe one example. I don't know if there's others.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes for me, that quantitative data sometimes is a little bit of a red herring from a user's perspective, and it is often a reflection more of the question asked or the data being measured, and sometimes it points you in the, not necessarily the wrong direction, but won't drive you to the right answer. And there's that, I think you were speaking to this earlier, Corey, about the art and science of design, but being able to maybe look at that data within the context of how it was understood and how it was gathered, and then applying just the right flavor of design insight onto that to really understand what problem actually needs to be solved there. And I've seen this happen a number of different times on projects where we kind of, you think that the problem is here, and you go and you try to solve that problem, but then you still end up with the same results after you go back into the testing cycle again.
So is that a case of having the quantitative data but not the qualitative data?
It's putting a qualitative layer on top of that and using that in maybe a feedback loop again into the next cycle, right?
I'll give you a really quick example. So I was sitting at West Point. We just deployed this new version of what we were doing in the military. And we were watching the results come back and people using the system in real time. And things were looking really good. Like all the quantitative data was coming back. Everything was positive. All systems go. Like clearly stuff was happening and it was all positive. And we kept noticing that this one person kept being recommended into these discussion groups around a particular topic of interest, and we couldn't figure it out. And so all of a sudden we started to ask ourselves, well, is the system like stuck on this guy? Is it something going wrong, like massively wrong here? And in walks a group of officers who just rotated back from Iraq, and they actually knew this guy that we kept recommending into these topics. And they're like, Neil, we know Neil, that guy is awesome. And I'm like, okay, say more, because the data was not telling us why we kept recommending this guy into this topic. And so what I learned from this group of officers is it turns out this guy has figured out some way of interdicting a new IED technique himself. He is teaching this technique basically face-to-face, so there's no online trace of what he's doing, so we can't learn from it. And he's teaching this in the field. And we've never seen him before. He's not a big user of the system, so we didn't have that much signal on him to begin with. But we kept recommending him. And so what became the story here was we figured out that through his social connections, the system was actually doing quite well. It was doing exactly the right thing because it had picked up all these new social relationships that he'd had indirectly and used that to learn what it needed to learn. But we would have never seen that if we'd just taken the kind of hard data approach, and it was a great example of being open enough to kind of the qualitative possibilities of meat space and use that to learn a bunch about not only how the system was working, but also how it was failing, and then fix what we needed to. So
Fascinating.
And just add one quick thing, without getting into all kinds of methods and that sort of thing, regardless of qual or quantum, believer of both, right, and the value of both. I think there's a couple things that are really important about data. First is the quality and integrity of the data that you collect itself. If you start with shitty data, you're sunk. The second is the interpretation and the analysis of that data. And you need to have the right people, whether it's, let's say experienced folks on the qual side, and not that it's a fine line, and data scientists on the quant side, but that's really, really critical. So then taking that analysis, at the end of the day, you need to have actionable data, actionable insights that come out of that data, right? So you can actually inform or adjust the experience.
Positive design outcome of some kind,
et cetera.
right?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, I think one point just to extend on that's changed, I think, in the last 5 years probably, and it gets to what Tim was saying before, is that machine learning, and I have the pleasure of working with some great machine learning people at the Data Guild, but I think machine learning is interesting in the aspect that it solves a last mile problem. You come up with a solution and you test and market, and it's a little off or it doesn't quite hit. And the reason is that everyone's different, and everyone's usage patterns, even in the most mundane task, driving, eating, sleeping, like we all do things radically different. We're all completely unique. But the machine learning aspect goes from sort of an objective finding to a mechanism by which you can develop a personalized response in real time. And I think that personalized response creates a last mile effect that lets you be known by a system, even if you're not known by a person. And I think that interaction and what that means for design is going to have a big impact in the industry, that everyone's going to experience the technology in a way that fits them like a glove, like completely bespoke experience based on their own data. And that's, to me, that's the opportunity that machine learning can fill between data analytics, insight discovery, and sort of solution development and real-time delivery.
Do we have any more questions before I jump into a couple more? Yeah.
What kinds of people are you hiring with this duality? Or do you develop teams that are interdisciplinary across functions?
Yes.
Bingo.
Can I take? I'm
What
gonna go a little. I'm gonna go even further. Let's say you can only hire one.
That's not what he's asking.
Which one of you is more important?
That is not what he's asking.
Is there a ratio of disciplines? Like for every quant, are there two?
Ratio of disciplines? No, we actually look for qualities in the same person, right? So we love people who are agile thinkers, who can think creatively about data, like an artist does, who has a problem with messy data and wants to figure it out in a very quantitative way. And we value those sort of rare birds, and they are very rare, that is equally fluent in both sides of the house. And we find, almost regardless of discipline or domain expertise, that core curiosity, sort of natural curiosity to apply knowledge and ask questions in different ways, quantitative and qualitative, is a super valuable asset to the team. So we when we work with clients, we actually, in sort of IDEO fashion, construct teams that are purposely made of designers and anthropologists and hardcore machine learning folks and statisticians. Yeah. And because that diversity of not just disciplinary expertise, but approach can really help our customers think through their data problems in creative ways.
Yeah, one thing we're seeing, and I won't name company names, but with large software companies around the Bay Area and beyond, is this dilemma that you point to, which is, okay, I understand the problem, I want to solve this problem, and as a senior manager, you have very few levers. Really, you need to build a team internally, and so we're seeing a challenge in filling the skill gap in terms of data science, of course, because it's new, and a lot of the technologies are new, and how you pack them together to develop solutions are new. But also, there's no data. I mean, there's just now data science programs, so you can't get a degree.
But they don't turn out data scientists.
But they don't necessarily turn out data scientists either. So you end up with this dilemma. And the trend I'm seeing is that you take designers and you take statisticians and you take software engineers and mathematicians and people who are interested in the problem, people who are interested in building solutions, and putting them together in teams and sort of forming these new organizations that didn't really exist before, but sort of have all these different pieces. And the key to everything working is that the walls are breaking down between the job titles. And I think that's a real challenge for organizations to sort of consume. So people are trying different things. There's hackathons that occur, people sort of working on specific problems for a weekend, that kind of thing. But how do you break down that wall so that people who are trained in design break out of what has traditionally been called design and get into actually this, the solution side? People who are doing development don't feel like they should just ship over sort of requirements and get back a UI layer to slap on top.
Right.
Because all that kind of dissolves this. It doesn't work that way when you start to think about the whole thing as a dynamic model. It can't. And how you test and how you deploy and how you support and how you document. I mean, all these things are really hard challenges, and I think it comes down to the fluidity of teams and the sort of the meshing of the skill sets, between all these different spaces.
We have maybe a minute left on here, and then one last question here. So, did either of you two want to answer that, or we're good?
That's it.
Okay, let's get some.
So, in context of the teams you just described, what kind of leadership do you have in place at your organization to drive those teams? And also, because of the new nature of this type of, organizational structure, how do you build new structures, processes, and synergy within the team?
Yeah. That's a great question, and frankly, something that we struggle with every day.
That's the question, for sure. Yeah.
I think it's a function of all of the senior leadership at the Guild being deeply dissatisfied with career tracks. We've all got really wacky backgrounds for what we're doing right now. And it's because we're out of the box people by nature. But we're okay with ambiguity. We actually like ambiguity. We think it's a strength and not a curse. And so it's a combination of on the one hand, being very open and flexible. And that's generally a good trait to have in data science these days. But on the other hand, all of us, Cameron and I have run companies before, so that comes in handy. On the business side, but also just from a program management point of view. So we've got a couple of us have also been like program managers for big government programs, and that also comes in handy. So it's frankly a mix of experiences. There's no really set formula, and like I say, we're still trying to figure it out.
We've got 30 seconds, and I see a big smiles at the end of the table. So,
well, the notion of ambiguity is actually a pretty positive one when it comes to fostering the right culture in these teams. If our successes that we've seen from an organizational perspective is really where we're not too concerned with hierarchy, and we have people contributing creatively across the board. I think, and I know Corey's experienced this because we come to design from different places as well, but start to blur the lines, as you guys were saying, between design and engineering. And I often find myself not understanding the difference between the two. And I can have very effective conversations with engineers and with creatives. And it's a very fluid environment when you do it the right way.
So I think, that's phenomenal. It's a really loaded question around how to operationalize design or research, and love to have a follow-up hallway. That said, I think, Tim and I were talking about it, and I think it applies here. This morning we were talking about a T-shaped designer, right? This is a T-shaped, I'll just call it a researcher as opposed to a usability engineer, et cetera, et cetera. And there's certain behaviors, right? It's from a leadership perspective, I push my team to question everything, right? In a constructive way. I push my team to take risks, calculated, educated risks, right? And I reward that. I push my team to embrace disruption. And we look for those people, to David's point, that love to turn, order out of chaos, right? And so it is, in all honesty, this new way of thinking. I mean, I see my role every day as I go forward being an agent of change, and that's what we need.
Well, thank you all for taking the time and coming here, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Yep, if you have any questions, please come ask.
Please approach the bench.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Thanks, guys.